Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's discussion about housing trust funds. My name is Zach Hillier. I'm the Leelanau County Housing Ready Program Director with Housing North. We're excited to be joined by Michael Anderson from the national organization Community Change to help lead our discussion on housing trust funds that provide dedicated public funding for the production and preservation of affordable housing. I want to welcome the Leelanau Housing Action Committee, who is with us on the screen, and thank Frank Clements for helping to coordinate the conversation on a tool that many communities, including in Michigan, are using to help address their unmet housing needs. I want to thank members of the public who have joined the discussion. I'll be sharing some links and resources in the chat periodically, and I don't want to take up much more time before we dive into the conversation, but I do want to say this. Housing North, we recently released a housing needs assessment for our 10-county region in northern Michigan. And probably to no one's surprise, our housing needs and challenges are great. And a significant portion of our unmet housing needs, both for rental and for sale homes, are for households with incomes below the area median household income. So we know there's a need and that we need to continue to build a comprehensive strategy to address it and identifying tools that can be part of that strategy. And one of the challenges is funding to help close funding financial gaps, enable projects to move forward, which leads us to today's discussion on Housing Trust Fund. Again, Michael's from Community Change at communitychange.org, and they have a comprehensive resource on housing trust funds at housingtrustfundproject.org. And Michael, thank you for taking time to speak with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Zachary, and greetings, everyone. We're in presenter mode here, so I can't necessarily see your Zoom boxes, but I definitely appreciate everyone making time for this crucial subject, which is what is the viability of a housing trust fund as a strategy that Leelanau County can use to help make some progress against the housing challenges that you all face. I'm going to start out with a presentation here, and probably about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit less of time to get through the slides, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and back and forth. So my goal today with you all is to give you an overview of this policy called a housing trust fund, and so you all can begin to think about the possibilities in Leelanau County. So again, thank you for the introduction, Zachary. I am with Community Change. I direct the housing justice team for Community Change. Since the mid-'80s, Community Change, one of our central housing strategies, has been to work with local communities, cities, counties, regional entities, and as well as statewide efforts to create, expand, or preserve affordable housing trust funds. When we started this work in the 80s, there was less than a dozen housing trust funds around the country. As we talk today, there's more than 825. Although the Housing Trust Fund Project and Community Change has not been involved in all of these campaigns by any stretch, we have been involved with at least 300 of them. We have been involved with housing trust fund campaigns in all 50 states at local levels and at state levels. So I'm very happy to be with you today, and hopefully the information I have to share can be really useful as you move forward with this discussion. All right. So a little bit more about what we do and how we do it. The Community Changes Housing Trust Fund Project has served as a clearinghouse for information about housing trust funds for the better part of, nearly 4 decades. This methodology is based on the housing trust funds. One of the most exciting things about this tool is with more than 800 around the country, what that means is there are so many different examples that we can draw from. And as I'll get into in more detail during this presentation, What makes housing trust funds so popular and so prolific is there's both a structure so that you're not, going out on your own and trying something that's brand new, but then there's also a flexibility and local control that means that every housing trust fund is distinct and individual from other ones. And anything that you all might think about as wanting to do in Leelanau County, there's a very, very good chance that another community, if not another dozen communities around the country, have tried different things that you can learn from and pull from. So what we do is work with groups like yourselves. We work with community-driven efforts. We work with configurations that are driven by nonprofit housing providers. All sorts of different configurations that come together to address and make some inroads on solutions to the housing challenges. So again, I salute all of you for your time and attention that you're putting in today. And why don't I start getting us into this topic? So affordable housing trust funds, in its most basic sense, this is the strategy that state and local governments use to fund affordable housing in new development, in preservation, in rehabilitation. The housing trust funds have allowed state and local government to have a predictable, dependable revenue strategy that is tied to specifically identified community needs in order to marshal the available public funds to their highest and most important use in a community. Housing trust funds are distinct funds that are established by legislation, ordinance, or a vote of the people. So in other words, housing trust funds not aspirational. It's not, there are things that have the name housing trust fund, where it is a philanthropic effort or a privately led effort that is pushing in the same direction, trying to find resources for affordable housing, but it does not have that same power as a policy tool when established by legislation or ordinance and is binding. Housing trust funds, in order to function, in order to make impact, receive public funding from the state or local governments that create them. And that could be directly through avenues that the state or local government already has at their disposal. It could be using creativity and ingenuity to look at what are other potential sources of revenue that haven't been tapped or that could be more powerfully redirected in order to execute a housing plan over time. The most common use of an affordable housing trust fund is multifamily rental housing. But as I'll get into, trust funds do a lot more. And I'll get into that in a moment. But the intention of a housing trust fund is to systematically shift the affordable housing funding from an annual budget debate or a process to a commitment of dedicated public revenue over time that puts counties, cities, in the position to execute a long-term plan to deal with the housing situation. As Zachary said at the opening of this broadcast, the recent data that's been pulled together by the county that shows where the housing needs are, it's both not surprising and not new, and yet quite daunting, and not something that even the best housing trust fund that we could imagine is going to be like snapping fingers and tomorrow the problem goes away. That's why having a long-term durable policy like a housing trust fund is so important. It's not just what is Leelanau County going to do in the next 12 months or the next 24 months, but frankly, the scope of this problem is such that a longer-term ongoing infrastructure approach is what a housing trust fund can provide. Housing trust funds, the impact of them can be seen throughout the United States. Again, with more than 800 housing trust funds in operation, many for decades now, it takes a lot of the guesswork out of if we invest this public money, what kind of return can we expect? In fact, there's a lot of really great information that shows that the impact that housing trust funds can have on families, on seniors, on our brothers and sisters with disabilities, but frankly, the whole fabric of the community is stronger when all the people who live in that community have that opportunity for the safety and security of home. And so, just in terms of this table setting, so really, there's a lot of specifics that Leelanau County needs to consider about what your housing trust fund would do. But as equally important as figuring that out is making sure that we have that resource question fixed. To just use maybe a little bit of a tired metaphor, if the housing trust fund policy is like a car, a vehicle that's going to get us where we want to go, we can design the best vehicle that's just perfect to get around Leelanau County. But if we don't put gas in the car, if there's not revenue in the housing trust fund, it's just going to sit in the driveway. So I don't like to decouple the conversation about what is the trust fund impact going to be and where the money's going to come from. That's an important question that Leelanau County is going to answer, and I really encourage answering it in one fell swoop. So as I said, there's more than 825 housing trust funds across the country today. As you can see, the growth of trust funds has been pretty steady in up economic times as well as down economic times. The reason for that is housing trust funds generate solutions. That these communities have seen the real impact it can make when there's directed strategic public investments in the areas that the communities identified as most urgent. This slide is very hard to read. I'm happy to share these slides afterwards, and Zachary can put them out with you. But what we wanted to capture here is just the scope of impact of housing trust funds across the country. And in the state of Michigan, there's already 4 housing trust funds in operation at the local level. So this would not be something that was new for Michigan as well to go in this direction. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the more recent advances for housing trust funds, just to give you a sense of what kind of communities are taking these actions. The 2 at the top of the list I put there because I think there's some important parallels between those communities and Leelanau County, even though they are in Florida. However, I'm going to posit that there may be some people who live in Fort Myers and Winter Haven for part of the year and Leelanau County for another part of the year. I don't know that for sure, but I think what those communities share with Leelanau County is that compared to most places in the country, there's a disproportionate number of people who are in retirement or close to retirement age, who their incomes are high enough to allow them to have multiple residences or to have a place that they can get away to in the summer. That's a great thing. That's a wonderful community to live in. The challenge is, however, is that the incomes of those people and what it does to the surrounding property prices often has a really detrimental impact on many of the other community members who are not so lucky to have as big of a pocketbook. So, all of a sudden we're talking about people like home health aides and the people who clean pools and the people who change oil, the people who are bank tellers. So these are real problems that Fort Myers and Winter Haven faced. In both cases, these communities do not have any kind of extensive history in investing in affordable housing. But both cases, the mayor and city council decided to enact local housing trust funds. One, Fort Myers using funds from the American Rescue Plan of $1 million, 1.5 to initiate it, and then making an annual commitment of another $250,000 annually from their general fund. Excuse me, I knew I was going to do that. I just told you Winter Haven. For Fort Myers, put in $500,000 annually from their general fund, no ARPA funds. Excuse me for convoluting those two. But I say that to say that when I started working with the local campaigns there and I had the opportunity to talk to members of city council and the mayor, they were really skeptical that could find any resources to do this. And I just want to be clear that every campaign starts out like, this is a great idea. It's too bad we don't have money for it. But the point is, as they started to evaluate what the impact of a housing trust fund could be and how urgent their housing situation was, they began to make some important steps. Now, I also want to be very clear that putting in $500,000 annually in Winter Haven or $250,000 annually in Fort Myers is not going to get you that far. I'm going to talk a little bit later in this presentation about housing trust funds, how they leverage other resources. So it's more than just those dollar figures I shared. At the same time, we need to be realistic here. We're talking about real estate. It's not cheap. So when we think about that metaphor of gas in a car, I would argue that Fort Myers and Winter Haven, really nice cars in the driveway. They got some gas, but they really need to be thinking about, I have a little bit further to go than what's in my gas tank. So how am I going to get there? Just very quickly, some of these other examples that are up there, Manchester, New Hampshire, and Nashua, New Hampshire, and Knoxville, Tennessee. All three of those are brand new affordable housing trust funds. Obviously, New Hampshire and Tennessee are pretty distinct from one another. One characteristic that they share is, again, they do not have a legacy of saying, let's use public money for affordable housing. This is a change and a shift that the elected leaders have made, both because of community pressure, but then also just the cold, hard facts of how difficult it is for people who, for generations, have been able to make a go at it in those communities to afford housing as it currently is available. So again, I want to talk a little bit about this popularity of housing trust funds and why it's so. Trust funds in their most powerful manifestation provide this transformational opportunity for people in the community to have housing that's healthy, safe, and within their budget. And, you know, whether that's for retirees who are on a more limited budget, who are trying to make a go in Leelanau County or stay in the county that's always been their home, or whether it's the home health aides that help a number of people in the county thrive in their living situations. Housing trust funds can provide solutions based on what the community needs. We know that families always do better with safe, stable housing, and that for families in Leelanau County, especially those that are in the workforce, not bringing home the big paychecks, that this housing crisis is extremely stressful and destabilizing. Housing trust funds are a proven solution that can be targeted to help families succeed. Certainly, I mentioned before our brothers and sisters with disabilities, to have a home that's actually fully usable by someone who needs adaptations and adjustments to make the housing work for them. These are things that trust funds are able, in the way that the ordinance is put together, to drive better outcomes in communities in terms of assuring that new construction and preservation that have trust fund dollars in them have, at the very least, accessible units, if not, you know, built by principles of accessibility and visibility from the ground up. And then, of course, you know, more complicated problems like people experiencing homelessness. Housing trust funds, when that's a community priority that needs to be addressed, they've been proven to be an effective tool in that way as well. So I lift up all these examples to say that what makes housing trust funds so popular across the country is that they are flexible enough to meet a variety of different housing challenges. But that flexibility and what the trust fund's actually going to focus on, that's decided locally. That's decided by people like yourselves and the decision makers in Leelanau County. So it's really a great opportunity to figure out what are your most pressing challenges, your most urgent priorities, and how can a housing trust fund be constructed to address those. So which gets us to this next important part. Well, how are these funds structured? And how do they operate? And I realize I'm going a little bit long on my presentation. I think I probably have about 5-7 more minutes, so we'll still have ample time for questions, but I just wanted to acknowledge I'm going a little bit over. So we like to think of housing trust funds as having depending on how you count it, 7 to 9 best practice elements. And this slide begins to capture what those are. There's a whole outline that has hyperlinks to our website, which I will drop into the chat before this is over. But in general, the 3 buckets I want us to think about for today. The first is the administration of a housing trust fund. Who is going to run it? The most common model with well over 775 of the 825 trust funds operate with a local government agency or department administering the housing trust fund. The reasons for this are manifold, but the 2 most compelling is that for elected leaders to have comfort putting ongoing revenue into a housing trust fund, we've seen a correlation that there's a lot more hesitancy if you're like outsourcing it to a new nonprofit that's running the trust funds than if it is within the city government or within the county government. The other important reason is often, the most strategic department or agency to administer a housing trust fund is an agency that housing funds from the state level or from the federal level are already flowing through. In other words, first, just the capacity to run the trust fund and run it well, but then also the strategic opportunity to be holding multiple puzzle pieces of potential funding and say, hey, how could these most powerfully be combined? And that happens best in a state, in a government agency or department. Most trust funds also have 2 important oversight mechanisms. One is an appointed board or committee it could involve many of you who are on this call today, but a group of folks with enough know-how to determine whether the funds and the housing being built is in line and in accordance with what the trust fund is meant to establish, and also people on that committee who have enough awareness of the particular needs of different communities that the housing trust fund is intended to assist or provide housing for, to make that evaluation. And then usually what it looks like is oversight committees can help select what grants are awarded from the housing trust funds, or they could review the grants after they've already been selected. So that varies, and there's no hard and fast rule of exactly what charges an oversight committee would have or what charges the administrative agency would have. One thing that is quite common and that we think is a best practice is that there be a requirement of an annual report that the administrative agency has to provide to the oversight committee and hopefully to the elected body that established the housing trust fund, that shows here's the dollars that came in, here's what we did with them, and do it in such a way that really, in its most powerful way, lifts up the impact so the public, the media, and others can understand how this investment's been used, but at the very basic, to give the community enough information, to give the oversight board enough information that they can evaluate and say, hey, did the trust fund do what it was supposed to? The next area, a bucket that I want us to think about is programs. So this is what will the trust fund do? And there's a number of different things that you all need to figure out. The distribution of funds. So this is a duty of the administration, but how the money flows out is going to shape the ways that it potentially impacts the county. The most common way is a competitive RFP, request for proposals. The most strategic way that's done is often combining that RFP with the RFP for other state, federal, philanthropic, or otherwise resources that could be used for affordable housing. Figuring out what are the requirements to get housing trust funds. So what income levels are going to be served? This is one of the most important questions. And one that there's always pressure among elected officials to look at the higher income levels. And sometimes that's phrased as workforce housing or whatever else. That's a fine goal. One of the things, though, when that phrase is used, I've often observed it doesn't include members of the workforce who earn lower wages. And so really understanding Leelanau County's housing challenges and what income levels. I mean, from what I understand from Zachary, the challenges in Leelanau County go up fairly high because the property prices are high. That said, those at the lowest incomes have unique challenges within that environment. So, understanding that and creating a trust fund to be responsive to that. Eligible applicants, who are the folks who can apply for housing trust funds? So with the exception of some niche programs in a handful of housing trust funds, eligible applicants are always organizations, not individuals. But still within that, there's a question. Is it just nonprofit housing developers? Is it for-profit housing developers? What about housing authorities? What about tribal governments? These are questions, again, that are very topical. You all are going to know who are the players who can deliver this housing within the county. And you want to construct your trust fund so those folks are eligible to get it. Eligible uses. As I said, the most prevalent use of a housing trust fund is to be what's often referred to as the gap financing for multifamily rental housing. However, there's a lot of most trust funds do between 8 and 10 different activities. And when we look at a national survey of trust funds, collectively, trust funds do well over 30 different activities. So let me just give you a couple different examples of other activities. So it could be down payment assistance for first-time home buyers. It could be income-based home repair for owner-occupied units, such as like a new roof or repairing gutters, or perhaps widening, making a ramp up and down the front porch. It could be land acquisition, where it's part of the trust fund is used in a revolving loan fund. So upfront, nonprofit developers are able to acquire the land, often the most expensive piece of it, while they get together the rest of the financing to do the project. It could be using a portion of the housing trust fund for emergency rental assistance when there are families and others who are at risk of becoming homelessness, and helping provide a safety net before that drastic fall happens. All of these things are, when I said I'd follow up with an outline, then there's our website they'll give you a much more exhaustive list of what trust funds can do. But again, this goes back to the flexibility. Leelanau County would not be required to do any of these activities. The ones that you choose are the ones that make sense for you all and what your goals are. Finally, the other bucket, the money bucket. Where's the money going to come from? And I'm going to show you a longer list here in a second. In general, the categories, it's either taxes or fees, program generated revenue, or interest earned, which that's a very low money producer. And then other revenue sources. We've seen a lot of creativity around the country when it comes to how to find trust funds. And as I said, I'll show you a more exhaustive list in a second. But before I get into that list, I want to also just answer this question about why dedicate public revenue to affordable housing. That's often, especially when historically a community hasn't done that, that's quite a common question. Hey, there's a lot of different priorities. Why is it that we are saying that we need to dedicate public revenue to affordable housing? And there's 4 central arguments. One is that the health of a community, the health of Leelanau County, is dependent on the people who live there and work there and make the county work, being able to have housing that's within their budget. When people don't have that, humans are incredibly ingenuitive. We figure out how to keep things going. But after a while, when it's a fundamental budget issue, usually when the rubber meets the road, that means people are either at high housing risk or they're leaving the county to a place that's more affordable to them. The second piece is the private market cannot respond to this challenge without public subsidies. The private market is in the business of creating profit out of the housing they develop. It's a totally legitimate mission for what they are doing. However, when we talk about those who the market is eclipsing, those for whom the prices in the market are too expensive, that's when public subsidy has to come in. There's not enough goodwill among the developers where they're going to take a loss on projects in order to make rents affordable. So the third is, and I was referring to this right at the start, is that the challenge that Leelanau County faces is not one that you're going to snap your fingers at today and it's going to go away tomorrow. This is going to require a longer term plan and the execution of that plan. And trust funds really allow for that, especially with dedicated, predictable, ongoing revenue. And finally, we can't wait around for budget surpluses. Like, I think it's great that Winter Haven established that housing trust fund using American Rescue Plan dollars. But like budget surpluses, those things don't come around every day. And often when you need it most, it's not there. So really getting serious about where is the ongoing revenue to meet this important ongoing infrastructure need is a fundamental part of an impactful housing trust fund. So here's the revenue list that I referred to a couple times. This is not exhaustive of what cities and counties do, but it really gives you a lot of examples. Oops. This slide has some timer on it that I am not sophisticated enough to know how to undo. So it's probably going to advance again. But a couple things that I just wanted to lift up. Again, I'm not saying this is the course that Leelanau County would go down, but I did a lot of work for about 8 years with Kalamazoo County, and they had over about a 10-year period, both the city of Kalamazoo and Kalamazoo County had made periodic contributions to a county level housing trust fund, putting in $250,000 maybe every other year. And so, and they were really having a hard time at the elected level getting higher than that. So they brought it to the ballot in 2013 and then went back for a renewal in 2020. In both cases, countywide, voters overwhelmingly supported a property tax on themselves to fund the housing trust fund. I'm not saying that's what Leelanau County should do, but I am saying that pathway was not something that the advocates and those in Kalamazoo County, when they first started pushing for a trust fund, even thought was possible. Once they went that route, what they found is that the electorate was a lot more ready to act with urgency on this issue than elected officials. But there's a lot of other options. And again, I'm not familiar with all the restrictions that the county has or cities within Leelanau County have from the state of Michigan in terms of revenue sources. But one of the things that I would encourage is thinking about things like lodging taxes, restaurant taxes, other things that there's a nexus between some of the reasons that Leelanau County is so expensive for some of its residents, which is that there's people with higher incomes who are able to enjoy Leelanau County, is their way to harness some of that and redirect those funds to meeting this housing challenge. So this is the last slide that I have for this presentation. Again, I think I've really run over, but and this slide is also in terms of being able to decipher it quickly, I really need a better slide than this. But let me tell you what this slide is talking about, is that when a state, county, and cities have housing trust funds with clear priorities of what that local government wants to do with those resources, it has an effect of being like a magnet or leveraging other resources to then meet those priorities. So for instance, we know that the low-income housing tax credit that comes from the federal government that's used to develop affordable housing has a very, very difficult time serving people at incomes that are below 60% area median income. But with an infusion of housing trust funds dollars, can be part of a package that could drive those rents down lower and make it affordable to parts of the workforce and otherwise that have lower incomes to start with. And so we call that leveraging. And one of the things, we haven't done a national survey since 2016. We're just in the process of trying to do another one, but we've been doing them periodically over 40 years. And it's been pretty consistent that every time a county invests $1 into a housing trust fund, that they leverage $8.50 in addition to be deployed for local affordable housing needs. So to say that in another way, if Leelanau County was able to establish a housing trust fund that had $1 million in it annually, that would average leverage, bring back 8.5 additional million, meaning there would be 9.5 million available to spend annually in the housing trust fund, or that would be leveraged by the housing trust fund, I should say. So that's another part that obviously makes housing trust funds very popular, is that ability to be able to marshal other funds to, in addition to the housing trust fund, to meet local community needs. So that's the end of my formal presentation at this point. I again apologize, I went way over, but we still have a good 20 minutes for questions.
No apologies needed. That was great. Thank you so much. We have one question. So I have a couple of questions, but one is, are there any housing trust funds that use tax increment financing as a funding source?
Yes. In fact, actually, the first affordable housing trust fund victory that I was had the privilege to be a part of was out here in Portland, Oregon, where I'm talking to you today, before I worked for Community Change, where we secured a portion of the tax increment financing created by Urban Renewal in Portland. 30% of those funds were then committed to be the funding source for the city of Portland's housing trust fund. That was later increased to 50%. So, and we're not the only, Portland's not the only place that did that. There's several places who do it. So it's a good revenue source. It also has a challenge to it. The challenge is that tax increment financing, in most cases, can only be used or deployed within a tax increment district. So one of the things that meant in Portland is those districts, I think, less than a 16th of the city, a smaller part, and and they're not all contiguous, and some of them are drawn very oddly. So that made it a little bit of a challenge of how those resources could then be deployed. So it's a good revenue source, but it has that complication that needs to be understood and sorted through.
And for communities that are just starting out and thinking about setting up a local housing trust fund or exploring the idea, do you have any advice on kind of how they could get started just kind of with that exploration?
Well, I think, and I'm a bad multitasker, so I'll answer the question and then I'll drop this in the chat. Actually, no, I'm going to do it in the opposite order because I think it'd be helpful for you all to see this while I'm looking for it. So bear with me here. I should have had this instantly ready to drop in. This will just take a second though. All right, here we go. Okay, I'm dropping in the chat right now. This is an outline that we put together on, as I was referring to at the top, the best practice elements of a housing trust fund. So the first step, Zachary, I think, is beginning to look at these different steps and figure out how this could potentially work in Leelanau County. As I said, the good news about starting a new housing trust fund is that there's a lot of examples to draw from. It's not like you're doing something that's brand new. It's brand new for Leelanau County, but there's just, whether it's like talking about, well, what should the RFP form say? Well, guess what? There's 800 plus examples of that. How do we, what does an annual report look like? What revenue sources are being used at the county level by counties who have similar challenges to ours? All of these are important questions that I can help you answer and to a certain degree, and then some that you have to answer yourself around what are the priority populations, what is the best, most impactful use of these funds, what are the revenue sources that are available. To me, the two most difficult questions to answer in terms of there's both like, well, what's the answer just based on facts and data? And then there's the politics. And so the two most difficult issues that really exist within that tension are the revenue and where it's going to come from, and the income levels, who is going to benefit from this housing trust funds. So those are ones that I think there's both, numbers and hard research that you can do, but then there's also, I think, beginning to take some political temperature of what's possible, who the decision makers are that would need to act to make this trust fund a reality, what are their priorities and what do they care about. So that's a little bit more of the nuances that you all are always going to have a much better handle on than I am, because you understand the players in Leelanau County as well as the politics.
We have another question. Do some housing trust funds get revenue on a fee from short-term rentals like Airbnb, VRBO?
Definitely. That is another very viable source. The question whenever I think about revenue sources is how much can we bring in? Let me just run down this road for a second. The actual price tag for addressing Leelanau County's housing challenges, like if you're like, let's fix this in 10 years, the number that you would come up with from a political standpoint would be astronomical. It's a number you could justify. You could justify just looking at the same data that Zachary, you were referring to at the top. This is a problem that's both wide and deep in its reality in Leelanau County. So that said, because the politics almost everywhere means you can't really talk about the actual number that it would take to do something like solve the housing crisis in 10 years. Again, it gets into more that nuanced area of politics. The way I often think about it is you want to find a round number that is higher than what you think is politically possible, because you're always going to be negotiating down from that number. And then when you think about the revenue sources, you want to think about what revenue sources on their own or in combination can get us as close to that number as possible. Right? So back to the short-term rentals. I think it's a great revenue source, but most of the places that I'm aware that have that, it's a second or third revenue source that they've added on to put additional funding into the trust fund. I want to say maybe the city of Cincinnati started out just with a short-term rental, and the actual return that they got, it didn't, I want to say it was under $250,000 annually. So Leelanau County, that revenue might be a lot higher because of the nature of the county and how people come there and spend their time there. So it's definitely worth looking at. But the question that you want to begin to research on any of these revenue sources is how much can we reasonably assume this would produce on an annual basis.
Thanks. Now, you mentioned that one of the strengths of a housing trust fund is the flexibility. But when it comes to are there any considerations between balancing kind of specific targets and that flexibility to kind of ensure a fund's success? Like between like kind of eligible programs and eligible uses, I guess.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I was looking at the question and answer that what I posted in the chat didn't go through. So I'm sorry. I told you I was a bad multitasker and I proved it. Can you just repeat that question, Zach?
I guess, are there any considerations between kind of balancing flexibility of a housing trust fund and like specific eligible uses of the funds to kind of like, could they be too broad in eligible uses, or is that kind of the what makes them so?
Great question. So, as I said, most housing trust funds have between 8 to 10 eligible uses. In a given year, funding might go to only 3 of those uses. So this gets a little bit to the flexibility. So let me give you an example so maybe one of the things that is an eligible activity is property acquisition, land acquisition. For the most part, that's not one of the priority activities that the nonprofit development community is working on. But all of a sudden, a city within Leelanau County is about to take an old high school and put it onto the market. And that high school could be converted into needed multifamily apartment housing. Then that year, the administrating agency and or the oversight committee might say, we're going to prioritize resources for site acquisition because we got to get that school. That is too important of an opportunity to turn into affordable housing. Or another example could be that around down payment assistance, that the overall cost of new homes in Leelanau County might be so expensive that if it wasn't like, say, a particular initiative to create home ownership opportunities at a lower price point, that doesn't really make sense to do down payment assistance because it's not going to get people over the hump. So, but it's an eligible activity because you're anticipating down the line, well, we could pull something together with a community land trust that would all of a sudden be bringing more affordable home ownership opportunities into Leelanau County. So even though that's not in place yet, we're going to say it's an eligible activity because when it is, we want the Housing Trust Fund to be able to take advantage of that opportunity. Does that make sense?
Yes. And so when considering, creating a housing trust fund at the county level, so we have, there's county commissioners, obviously, is that who you approach to kind of begin the formal process of that? Or?
There's not necessarily a concrete formula for how this has to move forward and roll out. One of the things I would suggest is, unless there's already a burgeoning interest, if not a potential champion that's on the county commission, I would want to spend some time fleshing out the different aspects of what a housing trust fund could do and what the proposal would be, and bring them more a baked cake than a list of the ingredients and the recipe. Because I think that housing is a complex area to start with, and if the elected officials aren't already, if that's not already a priority for their brain space, it might be that folks who are on this call right now simply have more information about what would need to happen and would be important to help sort of set the stage for, here's what our recommendation could be. That said, you don't want to get too far ahead and totally bake it and say it has to be this way or not, right? That if, for sure, if you want a county level housing trust funds, then that county commission is going to be a crucial part of that decision making. So being able to bring, say, choices. So we have most of the trust fund together. These are the activities that we're we're recommending would be most impactful. Here's the income levels that we see served. Here's what we think could happen for the revenue source. What do you think? What's missing? What could be better? And I don't think bringing it to them hey, this is something we're thinking about, but we really want to engage you on the ground floor. Again, if they're already invested in housing, I think that's smart. But what I've seen also as a fairly common scenario, if you go too open-handed to the elected officials, is what comes is like, what we need is a study committee. Well, you all already are the study committee, not that you've decided this is the path you're going forward, but like, and so that's why my recommendation, and you can take it or leave it, but my recommendation is begin to do some of the work yourself and then bring it to county commissioners that you think might be the most receptive to it as a starting place, and then get their feedback and then iterative process, build it from there, particularly exploring what's the path to getting the votes that we need to make this a reality.
We have a question about kind of staff capacity to manage a housing trust fund, and if a trust fund's set up at a local government level, are there situations where they would partner with an outside entity or a nonprofit to help with the administration side of things? Is that a common practice?
No, it isn't. This is a very good question and a very real question, particularly at the county level. Most counties in the United States do not necessarily have an existing housing department or agency. That's often the duty of cities. It looks different in state to state. So if what I'm saying doesn't ring exactly true in Michigan, stick with what you know to be fact. But I say that to say that one very common characteristic of a housing trust fund is between 5 and 10% of the revenue that comes in for the trust fund is used for administrative costs. In other words, you do need to pay for government programs to work well. This is, to make a covenant with the people of Leelanau County that we're going to spend some of your money in a new way. It needs to be managed well. It needs to do what the elected officials and what the members of the public would intend were you to get it passed. So there are models. As I said, there's somewhere between 35 and 45 housing trust funds that are run by nonprofits. Most of them exist in the states of California and Iowa, and the overall impact of those trust funds, in my estimation, is very much limited by their inability to bring in consistent, sufficient revenue to really operate. And whether that is tied directly to the fact that it was sort of outsourced from the local government, I can't say that conclusively. What I can say is in instances where housing trust funds are established and passed, one part of that story is a number of elected officials embracing it as a legacy policy that they want to be connected to. And I think in the minds and hearts of politicians, it's easier to have that connection if the housing trust fund exists within the government that you're representing. So does the state tax commission have jurisdiction over the tax revenue? So I'm not an expert in Michigan tax law. So again, I defer to those on this call who would be. But my sense is no, that the housing trust funds around the state of Michigan that are currently in operation, the revenues they bring in, that the state is not involved in that or has any kind of oversight in that I'm aware of. The cost of legal representation, well, that's usually absorbed by the government that creates it. But that's another reason why it's an advantage to build out a housing trust fund within the structure of the existing local government, is because some of that important infrastructure, such as having an attorney or a legal department that can help work through specific questions, is important. But I would also say that in general, this is not a legal issue. There are legal questions in different states almost entirely about revenue and whether it can be dedicated or if it's dedicated, what can a county government do versus a city government, what things need state permission. And in the end of the day, although some of that is legal, it's more, in my experience, most of the hardest questions are more political than legal. Local jurisdictions in Michigan do have some ability to raise revenue. It may be curtailed in certain ways by the state, but there is a political choice to be made. How do we want to use the money that we have control of and access over to? And this proposition around a housing trust fund is saying one of those priorities needs to be affordable housing and through the policy vehicle of an affordable housing trust fund. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, Jonathan.
We have a hard 4 p.m. stop time, but Michael, again, I want to thank you for joining us. This was very helpful, great information. So I guess for people that are interested in learning more and speaking with you, how can they reach you?
You can email me at manderson, one word, Manderson @communitychange.org. Yeah, and I'd be happy to answer questions or provide further resources.
Great. And I'm at zach@housingnorth.org. Feel free to email if you have any additional questions, but we will kind of wrap up right now. Again, Michael, thanks again. Thank you to the Housing Action Committee. Everyone have a great rest of the day.
Bye.